Okay, no, it is now 7:06. I'd like to call the joint board to order. Second. Yes, please. Let me give David Becker a brief moment.
So I do want to introduce and welcome to the board who will take my seat. This will be my last meeting voting in the interim CFO role with Tom Harris behind us, who can grab a seat, maybe at one of these at the table.
Tom, welcome.
Thank you. Tom Harris, all right.
Good to have you.
Nice to meet you. Welcome aboard.
Eric Calver, very nice to meet you, sir.
Tom Harris.
Confuse the issue on the Tom as well.
That's the easy one.
There's actually a rule on this board, no more than two Toms.
I think that's Eric's or
Eric is easy. That's Nick. Nick Weeper.
There is an error.
If anyone who's on Zoom can please make sure their names are typed in on their with their pictures, that'll be helpful, because this still is a new board with people coming and going. So it'd be helpful if anybody who is on the WebEx could even with the picture, there are some people maybe not know everybody so well at this point. Carol, I don't know if you can do that or not on yours.
I think I have to log out and log back in.
Don't for next time.
Yeah.
And then at least we have everybody on picture, because last time we had a bunch of blank pictures and no names. It was a little disconcerting. Okay, so Tom is.
Yep, so that's it. So
Is Tom a voting member tonight or no?
No, I'm not voting.
Voting tonight,
Okay.
he'll take his full CFO power, we'll say, as abilities starting tomorrow, at midnight. We'll do that. So we left it, so today I was on JRIB. And then, but today was his first day starting with the town, getting acclimated, so I just want to introduce him. As everyone knows, I will probably remain very close to these boards. It's a favorite spot of mine, for some odd reason.
I definitely want to.
So if we, yeah, and then if you want to handle, get 2 minutes to approve, and then we can.
Yeah. Okay.
Number 2.
Okay, so
Thank you.
again, Tom, welcome.
Thank you.
And, we're really looking forward to working closely with you. Next up is to consider and approve the minutes of both the 23rd of October 2024 and the 4th of December 2024. Everybody wants to take 30 seconds to eyeball these if you hadn't had a chance to. Everybody wants the minutes. Stop for a second. I got my plaque for Carolyn. Okay. Everybody, October looks good to me, but that's only one person. Does anybody have any comments about October's minutes?
No.
Eric, you okay with them? Okay, why don't we?
I'll make a motion to approve
Yeah.
the October 23rd, 2024 joint retirement investment board minutes
I'll second this.
presented.
I'm gonna make myself vulnerable and ask a question. Could we get these minutes before the fact? I'm betting there's a really good reason we don't have them before the fact in this case.
I agree with you 100%, and I think now that Calvin is gonna be our full-time dedicated recording secretary, we'll try and get that
Can I
expedited.
make another suggestion, Calvin, and subject to everybody agreeing? Could we get things like minutes and background materials attached to the appointment and put into a formal calendar invitation? So we go to one place rather than scrolling. I found myself going through back emails, trying to find documents. And
that could be very frustrating.
Say that again, Tom, I think I might agree with you. What were you asking?
I'm asking if we could attach relevant documents to an appointment that will be sent to all of us, rather than scrolling through series of emails.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. That's great.
It's very.
Thank you.
Most of us are volunteers. Many of us are working. I actually am not, but many of us are still working. And it's just balancing family.
Yeah, I can make that happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Calvin. Appreciate it.
There's going to be a major catch up of minutes to approve that Jen Carpenter, I believe, is working through now. I'm not sure if Calvin's helping on some of those, but there's the last posted minutes are quite a long time ago, several years essentially. So we're working through what may or may not have been done, approved, but not actually posted, but also the bulk of them, we believe, didn't necessarily get probably filed or approved and whatnot, and we're going back and retroing and doing that, so it'll be a big compliance piece, so that you'll see that soon, but those will make sure we circulate. As well.
Is that for all committees or just the JRIB?
No, it's JRIB focused. We found it in a few places, but JRIB was the one. So
Okay, that's excellent. What's the timing on that, you think?
I would just say over the next few months, I wouldn't drag much beyond that, but you know, technically, you know, to do that is watching, sometimes somebody watching a 2 hour meeting. that they never were a part of that occurred, you know, say a year ago, trying to go through it, so it takes some time.
Excellent.
And we can always bring them in too. They're ready, we'll bring them. Similar to, we worked with, you know, Jen made sure that these were done, so that we stay compliant, you know what I mean, on a move forward basis, we're compliant.
Okay,
I think we have two motions on the October 23 vote.
I'm sorry, we still, no, I think we approved October, we have to approve December.
No, we didn't vote on it.
We have,
I'm sorry, do we have
we had a second.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Any comments or questions about the October minutes? All in favor? Aye? Against? Abstain? Okay, unanimous. Let's take a look at December minutes. Okay, Wednesday, December 4th.
Eric Caliper, I'll make a motion, we approve the Wednesday, December 4 minutes.
I'll second that. Okay. Any questions or comments from the board or the public? Okay, all in favor of accepting the December minutes, 2024, aye?
Aye.
Any abstention?
I was out, so I'm.
You were out, okay, one abstention, Tom Collins was out. Okay. Excellent, okay, so we've taken care of that, we've accepted them. All right, we'll call. When we move on to the real purpose of tonight's meeting, which is extremely important. It's not traditional investment type of responsibility, but it's equally as important as a board. And I can tell you from the last time around, when we had the experience study and what the resulting reaction of the Board of Finance was, in URTM, it can be rather entertaining. So I'm happy that we have Milliman here in person to give us a presentation, because it's way, way, way above my head, and probably everybody else here too. So welcome, please come to the table. Let me help you. Okay, wow.
I have to read that first before we
Yeah.
get into this, right?
I suppose this is yours, unless
That
you're
one up
handing
top
over
is
beautiful
mine,
leather. Are these, how do you
So,
want me to do this?
I'll take it.
You sure?
Yeah,
Okay,
because we're gonna go in piecemeal here, because there's a lot of information to cover
it
tonight.
sure is.
Um,
And I'll warn you ahead of time. Whatever your normal
Yeah.
presentation level, bring it down a grade or two.
That's our brand.
I think we really do need to understand this.
So the first thing I intend to go over today are the experience studies. And then we'll go over the valuation results and how the experiences impact the valuation results. So let's see, what do we got first? We have the town experience study. I have red copies for the needs them.
Yeah, hard copies always nice to flip through.
This way, general-
Same as this, right? It's
Yeah,
just-
it's the
Do we
same.
need a hard copy of the town experience study? Sure, why
Healthy town.
It should be.
So before we get started, purpose was to do an experience study, and what an experience study of the plans is we look at the actual demographic and economic experience over the last several years. And then we compare that to what the assumptions predicted over the last several years and how they compare, where are they off. We're not only looking backwards, but thinking about forward trends and things have happened in the past several years that could impact future trends. And then we come up and make recommendations to changes in assumptions. The whole point is to have the most realistic value of the plan's liability so that you are funding towards a realistic goal, not an unrealistic goal. I'm gonna cut to the end real fast, and then I'll get back into the details. The assumptions, the studies showed that the liabilities have been undervalued slightly. So you'll see almost every assumption change is going to increase cost in the long term. What I have also put together, I put together this afternoon, no one has electronic copies, but I put together some scenarios of smoothing in the changes over a period of time. So you don't necessarily have to absorb it all at once. So we'll get into that later on, but just keep that in mind as we go through the numbers. And feel free to interrupt with questions at any point in time, if anything's not clear, or if you want me to elaborate further. All right, so starting in on the town pension plan experience study, we can skip across out to page 5. So we talk about inflation. So the current assumption for the plan is 2.4%. And where the inflation assumption comes into play is two main places. One, it's a building block for determining the long-term and expected rate of return on the plan. So that's the first place. And the second place, and probably another just as impactful place, is it's a basis for determining the cost of living adjustment assumption. Because this plan's cost of living adjustment is indexed to inflation. It is capped at 3% per year for most groups, but it is indexed to inflation. So there is a direct correlation there. As I mentioned, the current assumption is 2.4%. We've taken a look at inflation over the last 25, 30, 50 years or so. I'm going to focus in on the darker blue line, which is the 1-year trend line. You can see, a couple of years ago, it spiked quite significantly up at just over 7%. And it's rebounded back down to normal historical levels. So while there was a blip there, and that did drive costs up because actual cost of living adjustments were higher than expected, we've kind of returned back to norms as far as inflation is concerned, and it's coming back down. Another key piece of information that we look at is what the Social Security Administration uses for their assumption, and their long-term intermediate assumption is 2.4%. So it's right in line with what we're currently using. So we don't recommend any changes to that assumption, okay? Therefore, no changes to the cost of living adjustment assumption as well.
Jennifer, could I ask a basic question? Is this the rate of inflation that's tied to in the contracts the town has?
Yes.
Okay, thank
You talk about the measure of
The
inflation?
CPI, the
Right.
CPI, yep.
you.
So just to stop here, I mean, this is obviously a very important issue, right? Is 2.4, is that a conservative viewpoint? Is it, I mean, I'm looking here, it looks like more like 2.6 or so is the.
Right, and that's the current, and it's, we think inflation is probably gonna come down a little bit more again, the Fed's doing what they're doing to try to bring interest rates back down. They haven't come all the way back down, but we anticipate long-term that they will come back down close to that 2.4% level in time. You gotta keep in mind, this is a long-term assumption. So while inflation is slightly elevated right now, you don't wanna overreact to that and then increase our assumption for a long-term obligation. You wanna keep it more than a long-term outward looking. So that's why we're recommending to stick at 2.4%.
That's where the Social Security is.
And that's what Social Security is using. Moving on to page 6 is the interest rate assumption, which is probably one of the most, if not the most important assumption that we use to value the plan's liability. We're currently at a 6.9% rate of return interest rate assumption. And with public plans, the interest rate assumption and the expected long-term rate of return on assets are used interchangeably. So the interest rate assumption is equal to our expected long-term rate of return. This graph here shows the expected returns over different periods of time based on Milliman's capital market assumptions as of June 30th, 2024. You can see in the shorter years, there's a bigger range because a lot more fluctuation can happen. But over time, the returns tend to converge on towards the middle there, and we look at the 50th percentile, which is that black line or across the middle of that graph, and our expected rate of return using that 2.4% assumption is just under 7%. So we're currently at 6.9% assumption. We're not recommending any changes to that. Stay there.
If you don't mind, ask another question. You guys are preparing this chart here. is this chart based on our current portfolio
Yes.
mix?
Yes, it is, we take your current portfolio mix, target allocations, apply it to these assumptions,
Mhm.
and that's what this resulting.
Got it.
Okay, moving on to page 7. The next economic assumption we're gonna look at is pay increases. Now, for the town plan, it's currently, the current assumption is a graded assumption by age, so it ranges from age 20 all the way up to age 60. Starts higher rate, salary increases at younger ages, grading down to a lower salary increase at lower ages. And that's generally because people tend to get more promotions, have more step increases at those younger ages than they do later on in their career. For the town plan, it's fairly irrelevant because this plan has been closed for many years. And most of the people are, well into their career, beyond most of the step increases built into the contracts. So really the salary increases that are left for the remaining population in the plan is just, inflation, wage growth. It's a little bit of promotion, a little bit of longevity, but not too much going on. So we're proposing to eliminate this very complicated grading schedule and go to a flat 3.5% rate to represent the wage growth assumption that's built into the contracts, plus a little extra margin for longevity and promotions.
What effect would that have on the cost of the plan?
We're gonna get to that.
And I'm just curious, Public Works is a little bit different than everyone else, and that's why they're kind of singled out?
Yeah, so Public Works, we've singled out on all these, because they have a different normal retirement age.
Okay.
Really, they're kind of being lumped in with the remaining town employees for most of the assumptions, except for maybe the retirement assumption because of the different retirement age.
Gotcha, thank you.
So presumably a lower retirement age, is that right?
Yeah, the Public Works normal retirement age is age 59.5.
No.
The town is 62.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that's the pay increases for the town and the Public Works group. On the next page, we have pay increases for the Board of Ed. Again, this is it's a closed group, so a similar story. We recommend eliminating the complicated graded age scale and changing to a flat 3% salary growth, slightly lower than the town because the wage growth increases built into those step increases in the contract into the contracts is slightly lower for the Board of Ed than it is for the town. So we recommend a slightly lower assumption as a result. Okay. And then the last economic assumption that I'm gonna go over for this plan is the administrative expense load that goes into the calculation of the actually determined contribution. So just to set the framework here, the actually determined contribution, the contribution the town makes to the plan every year, it has 3 main components. Is the past service cost, which is the amortization of the unfunded liability, the normal cost, which is the value of benefits expected to be earned in the upcoming year, and then an interest component. I'm going to focus in on the normal cost component. We calculate the total normal cost, which is the value of benefits expected to be earned. We offset that by expected employee contributions that are to be made. There's a dollar reduction in that cost with that. And then we increase it by a normal cost, an administrative expense load. And that's for administrative expenses that are paid out of the plan's trust. Okay, so basically, the town uses the trust to pay those expenses and then reimburses the trust for those expenses. And it flows to the calculation of that contribution. Okay, the current assumption, the current methodology is to take a 4-year average of the last 4 years of administrative expenses and use that as the assumption for the upcoming year. We're recommending to stay with that methodology and looking at historical administrative expenses. There is some fluctuation from year to year, so taking a 4-year average helps to smooth that out and smooth out the impact on the contribution to the plan with each year.
Were there any unusual expenses in 1 year?
No, nothing unusual. I suspect that this upcoming year, there'll be a slightly higher expenses because of the experience study that we're doing this year and some other stuff. But nothing unusual, just it fluctuates. So rather than letting that flow through the calculation, we just smooth it out.
In the scheme of things, is this a very small part of the story?
It's very small.
Okay.
It's a very, very,
Okay,
fairly
that's what I
insignificant.
assumed, okay.
we're talking about $130,000 and like $2 million. Those are the economic assumptions. Any questions on those before I move on to the demographic? The first assumption that I'll talk about is mortality. I'm just covering this for completeness. There's nothing to be done here. We did discuss updating the mortality assumption last year and we did update it. So we're currently using the most up-to-date assumption that's available. So there's really nothing to change here.
How often do they change come up?
There's two components to the mortality assumption. There's the base rates and then there's the mortality improvement scale. The base rates get updated every 10 years or so.
Oh, okay.
The mortality improvement scale had been historically updated on an annual basis until the pandemic happened. And then the pandemic introduced a lot of noise into that study. So the Society of Actuaries has decided to just ignore that and just not issue any new assumptions for the time being. There is some, chitter chatter that there might be a new study released in maybe next year potentially, but that's not definite yet. So we'll just have to see what those results look like once that comes into play.
How big does a plan have to be for it to be considered credible?
Pretty large, because you're talking about, we're focused mostly on both as employee deaths, people who die during active employment, and the retiree deaths. But to be credible, you have to have probably 1,000 deaths during the study period. And so for 1,000.
We can arrange that.
More than people that have no plan or in some aspects of the
This
plan.
kind
So,
of
okay.
nowhere near that size, so to have that credibility. The tables that are published by the industry are best.
Got it.
Best
Okay.
guess. We do use different flavors of the table based on the employee groups that are public safety versus the general employee and so on and so forth. All right, so moving on to turnover. So this one I did spread out the public because turnover and retirement kind of work interchangeably. Because if you stop employment once you're eligible for retirement, then that's really a retirement event versus a termination event. So for Public Works, their current assumption is decreasing rates starting at younger ages, decreasing down to 1% at age 50. We took a look at the turnover. There wasn't a lot of activity for as far as events. There's 3 terminations during the 5-year period. We expected 2.8. So the assumption is pretty much, reality is in line with the assumption with the limited experience that we have. So given that there's very limited experience here, and we seem to be in line, we're not recommending any changes to this assumption.
And again, since the pension's closed, no one new is coming in is gonna
Again,
be 20 years old into the,
Yes, that's a great point.
Okay.
Keep in mind the turnover assumption for this plan has very little bearing on the actual liability because many people in the plan are approaching or will be at least early retirement age within the next 10 years. And that's retirement assumption will take over at that point in time, and that's probably the most important assumption. Okay, so all others, so this includes the town and the Board of Ed on page 13. Again, the turnover period, we saw the actual experience was pretty much in line with expectation. But again, many of these people are reaching that early retirement age. So this will not have much impact going forward. So again, we're not going to recreate the wheel here. We're going to keep things at status quo because experience is for the most part lining up. And most people are going to be reaching that early retirement age anyways. All right, on to page 14, we have the retirement assumption for this time. So this is a very key assumption. And I'll say for all the groups, we observed more retirements than expected across the board. So that tells us that the assumption that we're currently using for expectation of retirement is a little light. So more people are retiring at different, at all ages, really.
do we think that's maybe COVID related, that people just said, I'm done and I'm out?
It's possible. It could be COVID related. It's hard to tell, but a lot of people are, I think, just reaching long years of service and retiring as well. So we've made some recommendations to increase the proposed assumption. We're not going, so if you look at the bars to the right, the blue is the current assumptions, the orange is what actually happened, and the green is what we're proposing. And we're not going all the way to what actually happened. We're kind of just nudging it up a little bit, maybe halfway. And then we'll take another look again in a few years from now, and see if how that works.
This may predate me, but I thought there was a retirement bonus or packet encouragement at some point, incentive.
A few years ago.
I think that was a one-off.
Was a one-off?
Yeah, it was about 3 years
That's not
ago.
affecting these results?
Well, if it, to the extent it happened during this 5-year period,
It
then
did.
it would affect it.
I was wondering if the retirement bump is actually incentive
It
related.
might be, and I'll apologize, that was prior to Nolan's
That's
time.
okay.
We weren't
Yeah,
aware
But you have to
of that.
respond to it
Um,
this way.
That's why,
Like
yeah,
you said, you'll see in a couple of years.
we don't wanna
Right.
overreact and go all the way.
Right.
Because there could be some noise with the pandemic and any other things that occurred. That's why we're kind of going about halfway there with the assumption.
On the town side.
On the town side. And and also we're assuming that everyone will retire by age 70. It used to be all the way out to age 80. And we're not seeing anyone going really much, maybe 1 or 2 people past age 70. So we're not really seeing that, so we put that back. On the Board of Ed side, again, on the Board of Ed time, there were fewer retirements than expected. If you go to the next page. But that wasn't across the board. Some ages there were more retirements than expected. At other ages there were fewer. And primarily at ages 60 to 64, so just before but right around hitting normal retirement age during that range. We expected 41 retirements, and there were really only 21. So we're gonna recommend pulling that retirement assumption again back a little bit. We're not going all the way, kind of getting part of the way there. The other ages were fairly in line with expectations, so not much for recommended changes there. We're pulling back on the,
Do you have any, I'm assuming you do, have experience with other plans that you do this for? Where you've had similar situations and then you've made adjustments and then you've looked, in other words, are there some plans that are 3, 4, 5 years ahead of us on this?
well, everybody.
Where you can see what the reality is going.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know what I'm trying to ask?
So making these changes, so let's to kind of answer that question, let's take a step back. The last couple of years I've come here, I've talked about lots of liability losses that have occurred because this experience is not lining up with assumptions.
Right.
So making these changes, the point of this is to hope to mitigate that happening in the future or have it be less, right? No one has a crystal ball, we can't predict it perfectly, but that's the point. And that's what we'll do, and we've done that with other plans. We make changes and we monitor it and say, okay, yeah, well, now we're much more in line. There's fewer actuarial gains or losses happening from year to year. On either side, gains and losses are bad. They're both bad for different reasons because they introduce volatility into the contribution. And we don't want volatility, we want predictable patterns.
You're right.
Okay. That's on the Board of Ed retirement. For the Public Works on page 16, again, we saw more retirements at some of the ages, not all of the ages, but some of the ages, but primarily at age 59 and a half, at that normal retirement age, we saw a notable spike there. So we increased that assumption slightly, and most of the other and we increased some of the other assumptions past normal retirement age slightly, because we saw a lot more retirements there than expected. Questions other time. The next assumption is the disability assumption. There are no reported disabilities during the study period for this group, for any, whether town or that's. I'm not 100% sure if that's because there actually were no disabilities or if it's just the way the information had been reported. Because there's been a lot of, it's rare on the town side, but there's, and as there's been a lot of data cleanup on the town side as well. I believe now that with Milton, the town moving to Milton's administration system, that'll be kind of rectified going forward, and we'll truly find out about disability retirements when they actually happen, if they happen.
Yeah, I don't recall many disability.
But it's not very common on the town side, just due to the nature of the work.
Yep.
As opposed to the police and fire side. So because there's nothing to study, there's no basis for making any recommended changes. Our assumptions do produce a 4.6 expected disabilities over the course of the 5-year period, so 1 per year. We want to keep that there. We don't want to put it down to nothing because while disabilities don't happen often, when they do happen, they're expensive. So you want to keep something there just to help offset those future losses, any potential future losses. Okay, so those are the demographic assumptions. Next, we're gonna talk about the components of the cost method. And there's no real change here. I'm just gonna go through what we're currently doing. So the first component is the cost method. So this is for the funding method. The cost method is the way in which we allocate liability to past service versus future service. Okay, it's the simplest way I can explain it without getting too technical. The methodology we're using is what's called the entry age normal methodology. I won't go into details as to what that actually means because you'll just tell me to leave. But it is a very common method for public pension plans. It is the method you must use for your GASB financial reporting. So it makes sense to use it for funding as well. And so therefore, that's what you're using, and we don't recommend changing that method. The next component of the funding method is the amortization method. So currently we're at a 17, so you're using a closed amortization period. It's currently at 17 years as of July 1st, 2024. Last year, we changed the amortization growth rate to 2%. So what the amortization method is how the way in which we're paying down the unfunded accrued liability. So we're expected to pay it down over the course of the next 17 years. So assuming no future gains or losses, 17 years from now, the plan will be 100% funded. The 2% amortization growth rate, which we introduced last year, just builds in some growth to that payment. So again, assuming no future gains and losses, that payment would grow by 2% per year. So it's a pay a little bit less now, pay a little bit more each year over time. You still get to the same endpoint at the end of the 17 years, you're still 100% funded. It's just the path there is slightly different to get there.
Does GASB give any guidance on the funding method and the amortization method?
No, GASB doesn't give any guidance, but there is a white paper that is published by the Conference of Consulting Actuaries. It's actually being updated right now, and it does recommend a level percent of pay as a best practice, as opposed to level dollar, which is what you guys were using before. They're both acceptable, but the level percent they say is a best practice because the point of the contribution is to grow with your payroll and your tax base, right? So your tax base is growing year over year, presumably. Then you want your contribution to grow with that. So
Does the closed nature of the pension fund though change this, or do we look at a longer term period when we go to maybe change this out later? We know that, hey, in 25 years, there's not going to be anybody, or
Right,
you know what I mean? So how does that?
So the period, because it's closed, that really draws in on the period.
Right.
In 17 years is, I wouldn't entertain extending that, because the goal is you're 100% funded by the time the last active employee retires.
Gotcha.
Right, and then you live off the trust, and you're not making contributions for service that is not, you want the right generation of taxpayers paying for the service that they're receiving now,
Right.
not service that was received 10 years ago.
Gotcha. Okay.
So
Understood.
that's why it's 17, and given the demographics of the plan, you probably have about that much of a horizon before that last person. It might be a little bit longer, but
Okay.
about that last person
Thank you.
retires. All right, and the last component here is the asset smoothing method. Again, no change here. You're currently using a 5-year non-asymptotic smoothing, very technical math term there, but basically what we're doing is we're recognizing investment gains and losses over a 5-year period. So in any year, your assets may outperform or underperform the 6.9% target. We don't recognize all those gains or losses in any given year, 20% each year over 5 years. And that allows for some smoothing the volatility in your contribution and so on and so forth. Very common practice. Again, going back to the CCA white paper, the 5-year smoothing is a best practice. So you should be doing that. All right, so we skip ahead to page 23. We see the financial impact of the changes. And something surprising me here because I don't see the turnover column. So I do apologize for that. Let's check something in the other packet. I have the wrong chart in this graph, this page. Oh yeah, we didn't make any changes to the turnover. I talked about it. We didn't make any changes, that's why. Okay, so we have 4 columns of numbers here. I'm gonna get into more details as to what drives the baseline, because that's the experience that happened this past year. But just to show you the impact of the assumption changes. So the first column is the results from last year, just as a basis for comparison. The baseline results, the first column, the second column from the left, is we reflected updated census data as of July 1st, 2024, the updated investments as at that point in time. And so assuming no changes to any of the assumptions, if no changes were made, the actual determined contribution would have increased about $500,000 from just 5.5 million to just over $6 million. Okay, the update to the salary scale and the update to increase the contribution by another $160,000 or so, and then update the retirement rates, brought it up another 60,000. So in total, the assumption changes cost about $230,000 for this plan this year, if you were to recognize them all at once.
So 5.473 to
6.264.
64.
So that's for the one plan. I do have phase-in possibilities. I want to go through all the plans first, and then we can talk about the phase-in possibilities. Are there any questions on the town pension plan? Okay. We did introduce all the assumption changes to the OPEB plans as well. When I get to the OPEB plans, you'll see the impact on that. Basically all the same assumption changes with maybe a couple other additional changes on OPEB, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so next we're gonna go over the police and fire experience study.
We need police fire.
Okay, so the format of this is going to be very similar. Some of the pages are even identical, so we can skip over some of them. Which I took on very briefly. So moving on to page 5 first with the inflation assumption. Again, same recommended, you're at the current assumption, same current assumption, no change. The one thing we did note though, and when we took over the plan a couple of years ago as the actuary, although the inflation assumption is 2.4% and the COLA is tied to inflation, the prior actuary was using a 2.3% COLA assumption for some reason. To me, that doesn't seem reasonable if the COLA is tied to inflation. So we're recommending changing that COLA assumption to 2.4%. Going forward, so that it's directly tied to inflation.
So just your current assumption, 2.
That's the current inflation assumption. I didn't
I'm sorry, the
put
COLA.
the COLA
Got it.
on a separate page, but it does indirectly impact it.
It makes perfect sense.
And you'll see on page 6 is identical to the last, to the town plan, because the assets are invested in one big trust, so the same information, again, 6.9% investment, nothing new there. So moving on to the pay increases now for the police and fire plan, this is not a closed group. There are new hires coming in, so this assumption we treated a little bit differently. So the current assumption is graded by service, so it's a service-based assumption with high rates, 12.4% at higher, grading down to 2.9% at 25 years of service. We observed for the most part that we didn't see in those first couple of years nearly as high of a pay increases as expected based on the current assumption. So we're recommending bringing down the assumption in those first couple of years quite substantially from that 12.4% down to closer to 8% range. And then Beyond that, we saw slightly higher increases than expected. So we're just bumping that assumption up ever so slightly by about 25 basis points or so the rest of the year, rest of the service.
So I don't know anything about the details, but I guess how is the experience gonna be impacted by like the contract that was just renegotiated? Right, was the contract in negotiation for a very long time impacting what type of raises are?
Yeah, we look at those contracts as
Oh, you
well.
did? Oh.
and
So
factor
then-
that in.
That's included in this
That's
analysis.
why-
The
that's why
proposed
we-
assumption will fit what's in the new contract that was.
Expect it to,
written?
yes. The contract has about 6 or 7 steps of a lot of contracts, so I'm going off of
Yeah.
memory. And we expected it, there was, well, definitely higher increases at those earlier years where those first few steps occur. But then it kind of, after year 6 or 7, it kind of just flattened out to mostly just wage growth. Where we're landing at 3.25. The wage growth assumption, I believe, was 2.75% for the police fire contracts. So we're giving a little extra there for longevity. Okay, administrative expenses, again, the same as the town plan, nothing to change there. Right. Moving on to page 10 for the demographic assumptions. First assumption is the mortality assumption again. We updated it last year to use the most up-to-date mortality tables available for our public plans. So again, no recommended change at this point in time. The turnover assumption, we looked at
Can I
the,
ask a question on the preceding page, please? It says here, healthy or disabled use, and so does it, you have 2 different assumptions based on whether the person is a normal retiree or
yes,
disabled?
disabled retirees have a higher rate of mortality. Because they've retired on a disabled mortality.
So sort of an assumption, sorry to be cold about it, but
Yeah.
this is a flat assumption, you're disabled, this is the scale we use for you.
So for the turnover assumption or the termination assumption, we looked at the 2 groups separately, didn't really see any distinctions there, so we grouped them to both the police and fire together. And overall, we saw fewer terminations than expected based on the current assumptions. So, and that's not uncommon with public safety type groups. You usually don't see a lot of turnover. If you do, see it in earlier years. And once people get past those first years, they tend to stay until retirement. So we're recommending pulling back the assumption. Oh, the current assumption was an age-based assumption, and we found that a service-based assumption was more correlated with actual experience. So we're recommending changing to a service-based assumption with a very low incidence of termination during the first 5 years at 2.5%, and then down to 0.5% incidence of termination thereafter. Yes, moving on to retirement, we looked at the police and fire separately. And we did see trends to support that. So we'll talk about the police first. The current assumption has 2 sets of rates for prior to reaching 30 years of service and rates for once you've attained 30 years of service. And that 30 years of service is important because that's when people max out on their benefit, like the 80% max. So we looked at both before and after, and then we looked at in total. And we found, in general, there were more retirements than we expected. So we see more retirements happening than expected. And we saw a spike at 30 years of service. When people hit that max, we saw a spike. So we've modified the rates slightly from existing, slightly higher rates with that spike at 50% incidence of retirement when people max out at 30 years of service. And then thereafter, it bumps back down to 25% per year and 100% at age 70. So that's what we're recommending for the police. On the fire side, similar story, except for there wasn't quite as many. There's actually fewer retirements than expected, so we didn't change too much, but we did change from having the 2 sets of rates to having 1 set of rate with a spike at 30 years of service. So again, the rates of retirement at any given age are roughly the same, pulled back a little bit, but then we spiked it out at 45% once they hit 30 years of service, because that's what we were seeing. Any questions on that? And moving on to disability, there were 5 disabilities reported over the 5-year period, compared to 3.74 over that same period. So that's police and fire combined. So again, not much experience to pull from here, not really telling it, no compelling reason to change this assumption. So we're recommending to keep that assumption the same going forward.
Just to look at that, the comparison on 12 and 13 is similar. You know, this one is comprised of personnel. You know, there's a massive wave that sort of occurred, and we're getting sort of a trickle effect on that now. Just the question is we're now assuming that that's the way it's gonna be permanently, but when we look at the other pool, that didn't happen. So, you know, I mean, it's got a pretty big effect, assuming that everybody's out at that point, essentially. If they're- It's causing a fair amount of additional funding to project that.
Yeah, it does increase the contribution.
Essentially doubling, assuming that they're gonna be out at that window.
Yeah, well, we're assuming, they're not out at 30 years of service, but they're 50% gonna retire at that, and then the
Yeah.
remaining
So that's more
more
substantial.
substantial for
I
sure.
guess my
Yeah, we
point.
saw that spike, and
But you saw a mass exodus, essentially.
over the course of the 5 years, yeah, it
Yeah.
was at 30 years, we saw a mass exodus. It was a very
But
prevalent.
in the past, we've seen that in fire for a variety of reasons, both mass exodus, and then it levels out, and then it doesn't occur that way.
Okay.
Usually, right? So in the last couple of years, we've seen a mass exodus on PD, but it's entirely possible that that levels out. So this just projects because that's available info.
Yeah, so
or-
that's available info.
So what, I guess the thing is, and maybe you have other, you know, historicals to look at, but when those happen, there's usually like a reason for that. I mean, fire, there was, you know, sort of that revolving door thing that occurred where they sort of went out, but after that, it.
Well, from our experience with when a benefit maxes out at a certain period of time, there's not much incentive to stay for much longer. Yes, you'll get higher salary, so that'll increase your benefit, but the growth in your benefit kind of flattens. So there's not as much, so our experience is that people will tend to leave. And someone at 30 years, if they started young,
And they're old.
mid-50s, they can go find another job somewhere else and double it. We see that often with public safety.
Correct.
So that's, you know, barring any information that says people will stay beyond 30 years, like empirical evidence that to that extent, it's hard to support.
Well, they weren't before at the same number, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and it could be a cyclical thing as where people are in their career, yeah.
That's sort of what
And again, but this is again a long-term assumption, so
there was a
that,
major dump out of the department, right? Like a huge wave, some of that trail occurring. Right, we've seen the same across the street at one point in time for a variety of reasons. Then they have a tendency to level themselves out. Is my point. Just assume that never, it just goes in perpetuity.
yeah.
But based upon our data in the past, when those waves happen, they can be one-time events, and then behavior comes back out.
Comments?
Phrasing.
Sorry, I would speculate that there was expired contracts in that 5-year window that you're looking at. Police settled within that 5-year period, and that's why you may have seen a spike in police you weren't expecting. Fire didn't settle until last year, so you're gonna see a spike in the next 5 years.
So we saw a spike, but we saw a greater than 50% spike. We saw like a
You had
60
contract, you had accountability bill, and you had a particular wave of people within command staff that had opportunity that happens sometimes, but also just simply doesn't at other times. You had a confluence of events that more than doubled your numbers on the outbound. I guess my point is that would be very surprising to see that occur over the next decade. Similar to some of the things we found across the street, that even with contract settling and other factors, then didn't play themselves back out. That's. I get why you're taking that assumption, it's just, I think if you were to dig back and look at no longer are. Assumption whether it's gonna hold itself up.
What's the time period that we usually run the next one of these? Another
Usually every 5 years.
So another 5 years, we would revisit it.
Okay, so we're on to the funding method. So this is page 16. And these next several pages are identical, the town side, the funding method is identical. So unless you want to-
Identical.
Identical.
Okay, why don't we move on?
So moving on to page 20, we have the impact of the changes. So you see the 23 valuation, we started at $7.6 million. Our baseline, so this is just updating the data and the assets, no changes to any assumptions. Costs went up to $8.4 million, and I'll get into that shortly when I go to that presentation. This is that increase. The first assumption change was the COLA assumption, so moving from 2.3 to 2.4%. As you can see, COLAs are very expensive. This is just a 1% increase, 0.1% increase, increased the cost by $300,000.
But it's totally indefensible the way it was. It's just
Right.
not, that's not negotiable.
Right. The changes to the salary scale, there was an overall slight increase, even though it was a decrease in those earlier years of service, it was overall slight increase long-term, overall, the rest of the remaining years of service, that did increase the contribution by about $350,000 or so. The termination rates had a very minimal impact to the cost, increased the cost by about $40,000 or $30,000, I should say. And then the retirement rates increased the cost by about $400,000. So all in all the assumption changes, if you were to recognize them all at once today, would be an increase in cost of $1.1 million.
Find costs.
The contribution, actual determined contribution to be made. Okay, so those are the results of the two experience studies. Now we can go over the contribution,
The impact of the funded ratio be of all of this.
coming up.
Sorry.
Coming up. I know, there's a lot of information.
Tom just likes to show off.
Yeah, absolutely, that's the issue.
Bad Tom, good Tom.
How would you like to do this? Would you like to go over the town pension and OPEB first, and then the police and fire pension OPEB, or the two pension and then the two OPEB?
Say that again?
So I have 4 plans to go over.
You do it in the order that you feel most comfortable.
Well, let's do
Whatever
the-
you think most
let's
appropriate.
do town pension and OPEBs because it ties to all the town
Yeah.
assumptions, and then we'll do police and fire pension. So these look very similar on face value, but this presentation, so this is the town pension. Go that way.
Okay.
And then town OPEB.
I'm sorry.
You still say fireman, why, I didn't know we still say fireman.
Plain documents. So.
What was the question, Tom?
More of an expression of surprise that we still say fireman. Fire people, fire.
Is that what it's- Fire what? Firefighter. I like firefighter.
I like firefighter, yeah. I think we should blame Eric.
If somebody's coming to get me in a building, I want to be a firefighter.
Different.
I just did the town so far.
Dudettes.
Alright, so we're gonna do the one that
Okay.
is the town of Fairfield Employee Retirement System, which is the pension plan. Okay, so on cover page here, we got some key takeaways. This is, if I had 30 seconds to present, this is what I would tell you. The assets performed well during fiscal year ending 24, just over 10% return. Despite that, it shows the funded ratio dropped, and that's primarily because of the assumption changes. So we'll get into more detail on that in just a bit. There was a fairly significant liability loss resulting from larger cost of living adjustments than expected because the inflation environment was still very high. The cost of living adjustments were maxed out at 3% per year during the last couple periods. And then all these results in this presentation reflect, so all the assumption changes being made. So moving on to page 1.
Can I ask a question about the COLA? I thought I heard somebody say, and I apologize if I got this wrong, there was a 3% COLA cap.
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, and we assume 2.4% per year based on inflation assumption. So the losses is the extent that is capped out at 3% instead of 2%.
Is it carried over to succeeding years or is it just ignored? Thank you.
COLA's every year, I thought it was every 2 years.
It's every 2 years, but it's capped 3% per year.
Yeah, I got you. Okay.
Well, it's awarded every year for some groups and every other year for other groups.
Just to keep it
Gotcha.
interesting.
Just to keep it interesting.
Okay.
Megan probably has it all memorized, but. Okay, so this is so on page 1, this is a town plan, so it's a closed plan. Top left-hand corner of this page shows the head count over the last 5 years. And you can see the bottom section of these graphs that's the active membership. You can see that is steadily declining over time. The members and pay status is steadily increasing. It stayed relatively flat for over the last couple of years because there was a fair amount of retiree deaths during the past year.
So members in pay status or retirees.
Retirees,
Okay.
correct. So people currently receiving a monthly benefit. And they're broken down in more detail over to the right, the second part down to the right, between your the service retirees, those are people retiring under a normal retirement, your disabled retirees, and then surviving beneficiaries of retirees who have passed away and had a form of benefit that allowed for continuation.
Is there a percentage that you guys go on saying like how many people we're gonna give to, or taking normal retirements versus the with beneficiaries, or is that playing into this at all?
We assume everyone takes the normal form.
Okay, so you take the higher
Which is the
payout.
5-year guarantee.
Yeah.
To the extent people elect a joint survivor, that will introduce some actuarial gains and losses, especially because the conversion factors are not actuarially equivalent, they're tabular, they're formula based. But there's not enough experience there to really set an assumption that someone would take something other than that, but we could if we wanted to. So in total, the plan is paying out, about $16 million a year in benefits currently. The bottom left-hand part of this page is a distribution of the active membership, showing the concentration of age and service. As you can see, it's an older, more mature group with longer years of service due to the fact that the plan's been closed for over a decade, with the exception of 1 or 2 fire mechanics that are in the plan, in this plan, and that's what those 2 ones are in the 0 to 4 years of service. But mature plan, the one thing about a mature plan is that the interest rate assumption doesn't have as much of an impact as a less mature plan, because the horizon is shorter. But again, we're not making any changes to that this year. Moving on to page 2, looking at the assets within the plan and the returns over the last 5 years. The last couple of years have been pretty good years of outperforming the expected return of 6.9%, preceded by a very difficult fiscal year 22 that people remember, and then a really nice year back in fiscal year 21 at 26% return. If you look to the bottom graph, we're comparing the market value of assets to the actual value of assets over the last 5 years. And you can see in 2024 that they are essentially the same. What that means is that the deferred gains and the deferred losses are basically offsetting each other at this point in time. So that big gain in 2021 has 20% left. That's going to go away after this year. That was mostly offset completely by the loss in 22, and they have some small gains here for those last 2 years. But all in all, you're basically at the same point for both. Moving on to page 3. This is a more expanded version of the graph that was in the experience study presentation around the interest rate assumption. Just shows a more granular in the time horizon, and then up top it shows your target asset, your actual, how the plan is currently invested. Each bubble represents an asset class. The larger the bubble, the higher the allocation to that particular asset class. The smaller black dot in the middle represents your entire portfolio and the expected return and expected standard deviation, the riskiness, volatility around that return. As of, based on our capital market assumptions as of June 30th, 2024. All right, moving on to page 4. We get into the liability side. On the top left-hand corner is the graph of the accrued liability. So it's the value of benefits earned to date over the last 5 years, and has been steadily increasing as expected. From 23 to 24, it grew from 276 million to 288 million. We expected the liability to be about $282 million this year before any changes. Okay. In reality, the liability was 285 million before any such assumption changes. And the reason for that was due to some liability losses, primarily the cost of living adjustments. The main driver of the losses there. So we're in a almost $3 million hole just due to that to start. And then we recommended, then all the recommended assumption changes gets us up to $288 million of liability. What that does is increases the unfunded accrued liability. It decreases the funded ratio in the bottom right-hand column there. But still at 83% is still a good funded ratio at a solid investment return assumption. So nothing to worry about too much right there. That mainly is due to the assumption changes.
Are we close to any threshold events for our rating? I think we're single A rated as a pension fund, is that right?
I am not aware what the pension plan is rated.
I think the town is AAA and the pension plan is single A. I thought I heard this at a preceding meeting. I don't remember.
I've never heard of a separate rating.
Yeah, never heard, yeah,
I've never heard of pension plan being rated separately from the town.
Maybe I misheard.
So this picture should not have any bearing on the town's credit rating.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
At what point, just my own interest, at what point would it have an effect on the
we're gonna
town?
take a lot of factors into consideration. The pension plan itself is not gonna probably change anything by itself.
Say that again, please.
I was just asking where.
I heard the question, I didn't hear the answer.
The rating agency is gonna take a lot of factors into consideration. The pension plan and the OPEB plan itself are generally not gonna drive anything. Unless you were just completely in disarray and had really bad governance and so on and so forth, and there's nothing to worry about.
Thank you.
Okay, so on to page 5, we take the assets and liabilities put them together and we have a contribution for the town to make. And again, the numbers in the far right graph represent all assumption changes. And you can see the contribution increases from 5.5 million last year to 6.8 this year. So all assumption changes are made fully. And again, we'll talk about some scenarios in just a bit. And then the next page is just a carbon copy of, on page 6 here, it's a carbon copy of the results from the experience study. So I don't think if someone needs me to go into more detail on that, I will, but I don't.
I don't have that on mine.
Would you like a copy?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, you know what, I'm on a different page, this is fireman, so I saved some paper and got myself out of order, sorry, I
Okay,
apologize.
okay. All right, so that's what page 6 is the detailed numbers. The next couple of pages, pages 7 and 8, I've graphed out a 10-year projection of costs, both with no assumption changes, which is the baseline on page 7, and then page 8 reflects all the assumption changes. You can see that the pattern is similar from year to year, from one scenario to the next, but the assumption changes, the cost is obviously higher for all years. But you'll notice that the funded ratio,
That's what I was just gonna ask you, so how can that be?
because it's the funding method, it's designed to get you to 100% over a
Right.
methodical way, so it's just closing the gap. You're paying more now,
Gotcha.
and you're still on track to get to the same. The pattern is not changing much, it's just you're paying more. So
Okay,
you'll get back on track. with higher contributions earlier in the projection period.
Are we about comparable with other similarly situated towns, say other middle-class towns?
Yes. And better than others, about average with most. But yeah, especially Fairfield County, very similar. So any questions on these projections? You can see one thing I won't point out from fiscal year, fiscal year 26 to fiscal year 27, the contribution actually is expected to decrease.
Yeah.
And that's because we're recognizing that last bit of
20%.
that big 20% investment return. So that's bringing that in, that's putting downward pressure, but then we have some losses to come back in. It spikes back up,
Right.
then it drops again a little bit, then it kind of levels out. Because once we get to 5 years out in this projection, our actuarial value, that's it, market value actually equal to each other, we've seen those losses in that projection. And that's a key assumption in this projection, is that it assumes that all the assumptions come through every year. You know, in reality, that's not gonna happen, but this gives you an idea of where things are headed.
The difference in contributions over time, they're gonna do the
Yeah, that's like, yeah, difference in costs over time, yep. Assumption changes, cost assumptions over time. And the next couple
Right,
pages.
because you said the accrued liability went up from like whatever, 283 to 288.
Right.
So we've got the different in my contributions every year,
Mhm.
take the present value of those.
Yeah.
That's gonna equal my 5 million, right?
Yeah.
Very close to.
So that's everything on the town pension plan. Alright, moving on to the town OPEB, other post-employment benefits plan, which is the other packet that was handed out.
Then Tom, did you see your check mark number 2 there, funding ratio change?
Yes.
Okay, so on the
Over.
on the OPEB plan, again, a good return, 13% during the year. The good news on the OPEB side is there was actually a fairly significant liability gain for the year, and that was primarily due to a change in the post-65 retirement plan. The town negotiated a change from a Medicare supplement plan to Medicare Advantage plan, which introduced a significant amount of savings to the plan, which pretty much offset any increases and the assumption changes. So it was
Is that a required switch?
no, that was a negotiated change,
Okay.
that part of collective bargaining. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I will correct you, because it was not a negotiated change. The Anthem plan that we
That's
had,
right.
they pulled out of the market for supplement plans and was only offering a Medicare Advantage plan. So we had to move our population to Medicare.
Thank you for
No
that.
problem.
Okay. So, moving on to page 1, we again have the active membership. Again, the OPEB plans are not closed. So the town pension plan is closed, but the OPEB plan is not. You can see that, you know, the active population is remaining fairly level, with a slight increase over the last year or so. But pretty stable population on this plan. And you'll see in the bottom left-hand part of the graph that really heavily concentrated towards shorter years of service for the OPEB plan population. So much longer duration for this plan than for the pension plan. Moving on to the page 2 with the assets. Graph of the historical returns. Very similar picture to the pension plan, not exactly the same numbers, but same pattern and idea. Now, on the OPEB, for the OPEB plans, we have historically been using a market value of assets for calculating contribution. Last year, we discussed potentially introducing an actuarial value of assets methodology this year. So I've introduced that here. It's by no means required to make the change. But if you look at the bottom left-hand graph, you'll see in the year 2024, the market value is 43.1, the actuarial value is 40.2. So it's a lower actuarial value. That's because we're starting the smoothing with fiscal year 23, the last 2 years, because since the last valuation, we can't go prior to that. And so we've had 2 years of investment gains. So we're deferring those gains, therefore the actuarial value of assets is lower. You could choose to wait 2 years from now and introduce actuarial value of assets. And maybe you'll have 2 years of losses, it's good and bad, right? But you also won't have the benefit of smoothing out any potential future gains and losses in the market if you don't introduce it now. So something to consider. It will drive costs up because it's a lower value of assets for purposes of calculating the actual determined contribution. We'll get into those numbers again in just a bit, but it's an option this year. On page 3, again, is our analysis of the long-term rate of return for the OPEB plan, slightly different asset allocation for the OPEB plan. I don't think much attention's been given to that allocation as of yet. I think that's something to be addressed in the near future, and Josh can speak to that. But based on the current asset allocation, it supports a 7.3% return. We're continuing to recommend and use the 6.9% assumption that we're using for the pension plan. It's a conservative assumption, and that's our recommendation. Okay, moving on to the next page. Page 4, the accrued liability. So in the top left-hand corner, you can see that the accrued liability overall has increased from the last valuation, last full valuation. We expected the liability to be about $63 million before any assumption changes. In reality, it was almost $66 million before any assumption changes, before any updates to the health plans. And that was just due to some demographic experience, primarily due to the fact that more people than expected are electing dual coverage. So when they're retiring, they're electing coverage for their spouse. We assume for most of the groups, we assume a 60% assumption. And it's turning out it's happening more prevalently in closer to 80%. So that is going to be a recommended change we make, because we've seen a couple of years in a row of that same loss happening. So to offset those future losses, we're going to recommend that change down the road.
I mean, would that be that less spouses have it elsewhere? I mean, now as you move.
Yeah, they have it elsewhere, because there's
Like, am I
benefits
narrow?
very heavily subsidized. So they might get it, they have an option somewhere else. Cheaper here, here. So we're seeing that, and so therefore we think we should increase that. And then again, the introduction of the Medicare Advantage plans will reduce the liability by $10 million. And then we introduce other assumption changes that increase the liability by about $4 million, so we end up at $57.2 million. And the funded ratio is 70%. And that's again based on an actuarial value of assets. If it was used market value, it'd be slightly higher. Okay. Which is 70.4% for an OPEB plan in the state of Connecticut is really good. Better most plans, half the plans in Connecticut don't even have a trust, so.
No, 70.
Very good.
I was here when we started, so my past times on the 12, 13, 14 years. It's gotta be quite good, no?
Yes, very good, very good. Okay, so moving on to page 5. This is a good news I have today.
Yeah,
Can I just present this the rest
For what
of
it's
the
worth,
night?
I'm really impressed by it. I wouldn't have guessed that high a number. That's really a
So,
pleasant surprise.
okay, so again, on page 5, reflecting all the changes, you see your contribution was $3.5 million last year, and it's dropping down to $2.9 million, assuming all assumption changes are adopted. And on page 6,
Contracts that were settled.
June 30th, 2024.
So anything that came post that.
It's not reflected.
Not sure. So there's other pieces here that we won't see until the next round.
Yeah, there was an event, wasn't signed as a.
Setting of this, that in theory will run that.
Yeah, and we're seeing, so one thing we're seeing that the cost sharing is changing over time with the contracts, and that will change our assumption of who even elects the benefit in retirement. But that's newer still, and it's not enough to really warrant a change in the assumption. That's something we'll keep an eye on as time goes on. And that again would bring the costs down for us. It's assumption taken into effect cost sharing? Yeah. Okay, so page 6 goes, is the detailed numbers. So the baseline, again, it's just updating the data in the assets, and not updating any assumptions or any of the health plans, underlying health plans. And you'll see the health update column, which is the third column from the left, has a big impact of decreasing the liability by about $10 million. Cost pretty substantially as well. And then we introduced all the assumption changes that we talked about for the pension plan as well. Except for there's a couple additional columns here. One is the mortality update. We updated the mortality assumption for the pension plans last year, but because we do the open valuation every other year, this is another thing. So we recommend making that update to be in line with the pension. And then the second column from the right is the marriage assumption. And that's what I talked about, that's the
60 to
percent of
80.
people taking dual coverage as opposed to single coverage under the plans.
What are you bringing that up to?
There's the one small group that I think the department heads and non-union are already at 80%, so we're gonna keep them there, but all the other groups, we're gonna go from 60 to 80. And that had a fairly sizable impact on the liability, but like I said, we've seen losses from that for the last couple of valuations, so this has hopefully helped to offset that. And then the last column is if you decide to switch to an actuarial value of assets. You said it's a fairly substantial impact because it's 2 years of gains that we're not fully recognizing in the asset value this year. But it will help to smooth out future costs. Okay. The next 3 pages show a 10-year projection of a few of these scenarios. I didn't show every single scenario, but the key ones is the health update scenario, which would be basically the baseline if we make no assumption changes. This is what the result would be. Okay. And the next page is reflecting all assumption changes, but sticking with a market value of assets. And then the next page is all assumption changes, but switching to an actuarial value of assets. So you'll see with that one, the cost increases in the earlier years by a few $100,000, but by the end of the 10-year projection, the contribution is actually lower. Because you're putting more money into the
Right,
plan now, so
right.
you'll put less money into the plan later. So it's that same proposition, pay now or pay later.
More money to the plan earlier, which gets invested.
Which gets invested, benefits the returns,
Right.
and therefore reduces future contributions. So this just gives you an idea of how that impacts your 10-year horizon, these different changes. And that's the town open. Okay, and then move on to police and fire.
Closer.
Thank you for making these printouts. I
No
think it's, I don't know, it's still a lot easier to go through this kind of stuff on paper. Maybe it's how old we are.
Second, we're going to review pension, and then here's the OPEB. When is it? Alright. So I'll go over the pension plan, police and fire pension plan first, and then we'll do that. So the pension plan is a very similar story to the town pension plan, with the one notable difference that the police and fire plan is still an open plan. So if you look on page 1 here, you see that the active population is hovering around 200, slightly higher over the last couple of years. Distribution of your actual active membership is more evenly dispersed, different age and service buckets as a result. Longer duration, longer term obligation. Moving on to page 2, the investment returns are pretty much identical to the town plan because they are invested together. And again, you'll see that the market value assets and actual value assets as of July 1st, 2024 are virtually the same. for the same exact reasons as in the town plan. Page 3 is a exact carbon copy of page 3 in the last presentation, so I won't go into that anymore. We'll get to the crux of the matter here with the liability on page 4. So we expected the accrued liability to grow from $270 million last year to $277 million this year before any changes to the assumptions. And the actual liability before updating the assumptions, updating of the census was $283 million. So $5.5 to $6 million loss there. There was two main factors driving that. One was the cost of living adjustment, and the other was salary increases higher than expected. And then the assumption changes introduce the rest of the loss to that 288 million figure that we're currently at. And as you can see, the funded ratio as a result of both the experience losses on the actual experience plus the updated assumption changes brings the funded ratio down to 77.6%, assuming that all the assumptions are adopted. Moving on to page 5, you can see the cost impact on the actual determined contribution. There was bigger losses on the police and fire side than there was on the town side. Therefore, there's a much larger impact on the contribution from $7.6 million last year up to $9.5 million this year. Assuming all assumptions are changed. Page 6 is identical to the page the experience study again, so I won't go through that in detail again. But again, the next pages 7 and 8 show projection, 10-year projection of both baseline. So assuming no assumption changes and making the assumption changes. Again, you'll see a similar pattern between the two. Just that scenario with all the assumption changes, the cost is higher across the board. So overall, longer cost long term, but because you're funded toward a higher, more realistic liability. Any questions? Moving on to the police and fire OPEB. Again, this is an open group, so pretty stable population over the last several years. And again, a more dispersed membership. Ranging all ages and years of service on page 1. Again, moving on to page 2, the returns are similar to the pension plan. And again, we're considering introducing the actual value of assets on page 2. So you can see that if you were to adopt an asset smoothing method this year, that the actual value of assets would be about $3 million less than the market value of assets. Therefore, it result in higher costs. Same idea as on the town side. Page 3 is identical to the town OPEB, so I won't go over that again. Getting to the experience and the resulting accrued liability. The accrued liability was $89.5 million last year. We expected it to increase to about $95.5 million this year, based on an updated census without reflecting the health plans. It actually grew to $97.4 million, so there was about a $2 million loss there. The main driver of that again was those electing the dual coverage as opposed to single coverage. On the police and fire side, we had a 6% assumption across the board, again, 11%. And then that was all offset by a $10.5 million gain due to the switch to the Medicare Advantage plans. And then that was partially offset by the losses due to the assumption changes that we covered during on the experience study. The end result is that you're at a liability of $94.3 million, an increase in the funded ratio. Despite all that, there's a lot of offsetting movement there, but funded ratio did grow from 40% to 47.3% this year. So again, almost 50% funded is a good place to be for an OPEB plan in the city of Connecticut. Moving on to page 5, yeah,
Do you happen to know what you use for an inflation rate for healthcare expenses?
we use the same 2.4%. So, well, there's two components, there's general inflation and then there's healthcare trend. And that is a very complicated assumption. It goes, it's like a 50-year assumption. But it starts off high and it tails down to about 4% per year over time. I don't have that in front of me right now, but our valuation report has that detailed year by year assumptions. Okay, so the cost, the contribution last year was 5.9, increased to about 6.4 with all reflecting all assumption changes. Moving on to page 6 in the details again. We had it's all the same assumption changes that we had for the pension plan with the addition of a few columns. Again, introducing the mortality assumption because that wasn't introduced yet. Because the OPEB is done every other year. Updating the marriage assumption from 60% to 80%. And then again, the option to introduce an asset smoothing method as well. And that gets you at $6.4 million. So that's all the plans. And as I mentioned at the beginning of all of this, you're gonna see a lot of increase in cost and we can discuss some options for smoothing those increase over time. So I put together, this afternoon I put together, this wasn't in the advanced packet, but I put this information together this afternoon, showing 2 options for phasing in the assumptions, phasing in over a 2-year period or over a 3-year period. I wouldn't recommend going beyond a 3-year period because remember, we're gonna evaluate assumptions again in 5 years. If you go much further on, you'll just finish recognizing them all and then potentially change them again, and you're never gonna really catch up. So I would recommend 2 or 3 years on that.
Your experience, I'm fighting with it, a demon here, meaning obviously there are some people in town who would like to see it smoothed and made more palatable. And yet that's a political, not necessarily an economic decision. And I'm throwing this out not to you, to the board in general, in terms of what our decision making. We have authorities, but we also have what's right. And what should, I'm not even arguing for what's right, that's the wrong word here. Because right is a relative and subjective question. But I think somebody help me out here, you all know what I'm trying to say here. In other words, I'm uncomfortable because I feel like we're veering, we've sat here for the last hour or so getting an extremely expert, I don't mean that expert presentation on a very complicated subject, and I really do feel like you've explained it to us in a way that we can understand it, so I appreciate that. And now I feel like we're veering into a political discussion that I'm not sure I'm comfortable with. That's all I'm trying. I'm not arguing for one or the other or any which way. But anybody else has a comment on that, please.
So first of all, I just want to say, I really think Jen presenting this board before the Board of Finance, right? So we actually have time to kind of read this, understand it, feel it, and then debate it. We didn't have that ability. That's nice. That we got that back. That being said, on Ken's point, it is a very long-term liability.
Right.
We're looking at 10-year projections, but it really goes out much longer than that. Hopefully I'll live beyond 10 years for both the OPEB and the pension. So based upon that, I don't see any regrets or apprehension into smoothing any changes because they are a 30+ year liability. So just my personal opinion.
Yeah, that's like to
And
hear.
it's not a political one, just only because looking at the lifespan of what these two or trusts basically provide. Yeah.
Is there any experience from like-minded towns or peer groups, you might want to call peer towns, in terms of how they handle these kind of changes?
So when the public plan mortality assumptions came about. And we introduced those to a lot of our clients. That was a big change and increased liabilities fairly significantly. I'd say probably about 40% to half of our clients smoothed in that impact over a 2-year period. Some did 3. So it's not unheard of to smooth in this. It's not unreasonable to smooth in the impact of an assumption change over a reasonable period of time. The one thing that's new now versus maybe the last time assumption changes were made is that the actual standard of practice have evolved a bit, that if we do smooth in the results, I still need to disclose in the report what the contribution would be without the smoothing. Doesn't mean I have to contribute it,
Right.
but I have to disclose it. I'm required to disclose it. If I don't, then my professional credentials are.
So all of a sudden, the town is
And given that it's a public document, that's.
sort of violating its
So just something to be.
declared
aware of.
intention from my days at the Board of Finance.
Well, that would also, right, your bond rating agencies would look
We're
at
seeing
that,
that.
because now, you're.
Exactly.
That's the ADAC that you're not fully funding, that's the way they're gonna be presented as.
And as a Board of Finance, and again, it may have changed since I was on the Board of Finance, maybe David can comment, but we always made a big deal out of committing to fully fund the ADAC.
Correct, so I don't have the answer, and I'm not sure we're gonna get it tonight from Matt Spurndle from Phoenix as to, what they would look at with that. I mean, so I don't know if you can answer at all, otherwise, it punts to him at a later date, but that's the biggest piece that they've historically looked at. The one piece that comes up on the call, and otherwise, to your point about earlier about, there's not a lot of discussion, it's that we fund the ADAC. So does that footnote declare in some form that we are not doing that? I don't know the answer, and I don't know what they do that when they smooth it.
The actual standards of
There's
practice.
a lot of footnotes.
Yeah,
in
they
there.
allow for, this is referred to as an output smoothing method. It's another way of smoothing your costs. And there's nothing from an actuarial perspective, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as it's done within a reasonable period of time. And we're talking about 2 or 3 years.
So
My
Jen,
preference would be 2 years, but I could live with 3.
I actually would echo what Ken was saying, there's risk veering into politics here. So to kind of remove us from that, is there a convention among peer towns, maybe in Connecticut or New England? Because there are 2 different questions here. One is the 2-year versus 3-year, and the other is the market value of assets versus actuarial value.
That's just for the open.
So there are 2 big questions that, lead to different impacts. Is either one is there a standard for either one, or are they both kind of up in the air?
Yeah, there's no real
No
standard.
right answer for either.
And then so to clarify, the market versus actuarial, if you decide to not introduce the actual value this year, stick with market, I don't have to disclose that because that's not smoothing in anything. We're gonna revisit it in 2 years from now. Maybe we'll introduce an actual value.
I guess I'm getting away from disclosure and
I mean,
conventional.
well, it's really what is the right, every town has, it's what's right for their town. their
Well,
community,
your answer to
right?
Tom's question was, you said about half and half.
Yeah, yes, and when the last time that we saw a prevalence of smoothing in results was with the mortality update, because that increased costs by more than people could, like liabilities by 5 or 6%.
But that was a
and
big,
contributions
that was a
by
big hullabaloo
doubled. It was a big hullabaloo and
Right.
and it was it
for
was-
those who were around at the time.
and it had a big impact on the
Right.
costs and communities the budgets couldn't withstand all of it at once, so it was very reasonable. And a
So
very
there's-
efficient.
Do you find that other towns use different methods, like actuarial versus market? One for OPEB, different method than one for the pension?
So actuarial versus market really is a function of the funded status of the plan. Because think of a plan that's really poorly funded. You can lose 20% in your assets. It's a small number relative to the liability. It's not gonna make it really move the budget, move your needle all that much. It's not gonna have much of an impact. But as you get better funded, a 10% loss or 3% loss on your assets has a much bigger impact than a poorly funded plan. Right, so while it's great to be really well funded, with it comes different challenges.
So could we draw a conclusion? I suspect you're gonna say no, but could we draw the conclusion that given our funded status, we should go for an actuarially determined value?
That's my recommendation, just because you want to smooth out potential future gains and losses. by no means are you obligated to
I
make that
understand, but the
change,
rationale would be.
but that's the rationale.
Can I ask, we have a new member, Tom, and I'd like to kind of,
Great point.
kind of feels, because.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, basically, there's no red flag in terms of the ability to meet your future obligations. And you're looking at a risk, and I think the reasonable thing to do is to spread that risk over a reasonable period of time, which is 2 years. So to me, it's kind of a no-brainer, in a sense. And but I don't think there are any political implications to doing that. Maybe there are, but.
Yeah.
No, what I meant was, I'm sorry, Tom, what I meant wasn't implications, it's a political decision.
Yeah, right, okay.
So, yeah, and that's an interesting one, and it's an interesting choice of the words, right? So though, we'd have to go back 2 or 3 experience studies. I think Mike was in office at the time, and you and I were on the BOF and came here and left pretty frustrated. So I would note, I asked for the potential, options, but stayed completely away from the experience study. I believe at the time there was frustration because there was some wading into the experience piece and some of the factors from the administration prior to that point. Whatever the board ultimately does today, we're gonna have to find a way to pay for it. I would just say that thinking of things in a silo is can be tough and should just from, it's not political, it's governmental, in that, this is taking it's catching up on a lot of things from many, many years. Sort of, and can we do it in one shot or can you spread it out? And I would agree. It's the easy thing to say, oh, take it over 3, but I think it's, take it over 2, it's a little more logical.
2 years is, you don't wanna
You
go.
don't wanna go tinkering beyond that, but this is a big catch up. And so.
Without being sarcastic, does anybody ever smooth out if it's the other way? No, I'm being serious.
I've never had a client do that. We have some clients that are overfunded that are putting, so, once you get to a certain point, your contributions go down. It's really tempting to just pocket all that money.
That's how public companies got into trouble managing earnings.
And when we have clients get to that, we try to tell them, resist that urge, continue to at least make level contributions and put that away. It doesn't have to go into the plan. You could put it into a reserve fund so it's not irrevocable. Right?
So.
You're not in this situation, so.
So I'll go back, and I'm not sure, I don't think it was that year, but I think it was a subsequent year, the BOF actually raised the amount of the contribution, because they were equally, we were ticked about something else with, to keep it level funded to do no harm.
The
So
proposal we actually made, this
I
is
can't,
off
it was a
topic,
while ago, but
was
it's.
to never let it be lower than the year before.
Yeah.
That's what we
Yeah.
were talking, that you,
And
so
there
you
was
and I-
something else that had been done, and we were like, no, and kept it at.
So just to circle back on the disclosure that I'd have to put in a report if you decide to smooth out. The ADEC is still the smooth contribution, so you're still on paper making 100% of the ADEC. Because that's a component of the funding method, is the smoothing of the output. Okay, so on your footnote disclosures for your financial reporting, you will make 100% of the ADEC if you make 100% of the smooth contribution.
Got it.
Okay.
I mean, we're kind of
I just have
smoothing our normal cost, right? In the cost.
Yeah, and spreading out the impact on the unfunded liability over a 2-year period. Yeah, it's not, and if it's 2 years, 3 years, it's reasonable. It's not like you're saying we're gonna smooth it over 10 years. That would be unreasonable. That would raise red flags. So really, the footnote that I'm talking about is gonna be just a little sentence in my report somewhere. It's not gonna be like highlighted and on display. It's just something that I'm required to say that if that you chose to use an output smoothing method as part of your cost method, which is a reasonable, acceptable practice. But if you were to not use that output smoothing method, this is what the resulting contribution would have been.
Being transparent.
Just being transparent.
There's little to no chance that the
that's-
Board of Finance would say, we go for the 2 year smoothing and said, you know what, we're gonna pay, forget it, we'll pay what the footnote tells it to do. There's no chance of that. Is there?
highly unlikely.
Just put it out there.
And it's just, yeah, it's transparency, the revised actual standard practice. We're really geared towards public plans for more transparency because there is not a lot of transparency in public plans. So that was why, why these revisions were made.
Is it? I'm talking to the whole group. Something we vote on tonight? Okay, that's number one. Are we able to vote to accept the report and accept all the changes that you're recommending? And leave the smoothing to the Board of Finance's discretion? No, it's how they handle the contributions,
We make a recommendation.
you know what I'm saying?
We make a
I mean,
recommendation.
why should we be making a determination how the town is gonna fund a problem?
Can I ask a question?
There's a recommendation to the funding method, so that is, I think, falls.
Is this a part of the budget which would be approved by?
J-RIB votes, and then it rolls up, and then they determine, well, the first selectman in the proposed budget, adopted by the Board of Selectmen, and then adopted by the Board of Finance, and then down to the RTM, makes all their votes, but it starts here. That was the timing issue last year, where it crunched up a little bit. But yeah, this board makes that.
So David, are you saying this is in effect a recommendation anyway? It's not a decision?
Well, the calculations, and then we either follow it or we don't, but the other boards have historically, I mean, they're gonna short. If the other boards don't, right, by the time you get to the end, it's not fully funding the ADAC at that point. Because they chose a different number, even if they had a calculation said, but I could have smoothed it, right? If the RTM gets it and changes all the lines to the 3-year, if this board didn't adopt that as the ADAC, it doesn't count as fully.
So we're sending an ADAC to the.
You send,
board.
you send it,
Got it, okay.
you send it, and I speak of.
So it really isn't a
as
recommendation. I mean, sort of, and it functions as one, but it isn't really.
It's a very strong.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not then fully, if it's not then fully funded at that level, we're not fully.
You know, it's
They
also,
don't get to pick the ADAC,
it's funny,
it's on here.
because it, depending on where you sit, meaning these two guys, the numbers aren't, you know, in other words, my initial reaction is, what's the big deal, right? I mean, it's not huge numbers, one way or another.
So if we do the 2-year phase in, that's a bump of over the no assumption change, that's a bump of 2.55 million, give or take.
Were you looking?
I may have calculated it.
Oh, okay. Versus, was it 2.9?
I don't know what the total change if you do all the assumption change, but just like put some numbers to what you're saying. Yeah, you look at the numbers, like, so if you sum, you know, column A versus column C.
Right.
And the difference is like 2.55 million. Do you know the sum total difference? between,
I
like-
don't have, because it's, you're not gonna pick all 3 of them, it's either gonna be, for OPEB, it's either gonna be with market value or actual value, so.
Oh,
It's
sure.
it's the first 2 rows plus either the second 2 rows or the third, or the.
Oh,
last
yeah,
2
yeah,
rows.
yeah, yeah.
Say that again?
Wrong thing.
It's gonna be the first,
You're right.
first 2
You have
rows,
to choose market
Yeah,
or
plus
actual.
either,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
either the second 2 rows or the last 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
I summed too many things.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So do it again. So am I comparing the first row to the third or?
So if you wanna look at the sum total of all 4 plans,
Mhm.
you take the first 2 rows plus either, if you decide to go market value, it's the second 2 rows. If you decide to use actual value for OPEB, it's the first 2 rows plus the last 2 rows. And you compare either no changes to 2-year phase in versus 3-year phase in.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I overstated
Right,
it
right,
by
right.
a lot.
So yeah, it's not
No, it's
not
like
good.
1.9.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like we're leading towards the 2-year phase.
If we can afford it, it seems reasonable.
Well, I'm going by Jen's body language that she doesn't, I know you said 3 years would not be. out
I'm
of the-
comfortable with you.
Right, but you're more comfortable with two.
I'm an actuary, I'm
I
always gonna
understand.
be
I
conservative.
And then, look, that's what we're paying you for. It certainly would be to the town's preference to have a 2-year phase-in versus an immediate phase-in. It doesn't strike me as being outrageous. I guess the only question I have, which we can't answer here, so it doesn't really matter, is whether or not either rating agencies or bond investors would see this as being in some way or another shirking our responsibilities. I'm using straight, a little bit overly strong language, but
I could even expand that, Ken,
Yeah.
only because this is so important, because this might be out of the usual protocol. Josh, putting you on the spot, you're an actuary as well, right?
Yes,
Are you allowed to talk?
yes, I can.
All right, so my question is, since this is so important, would it make sense, and Jen, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, since there's another actuary in the room, and there are only two of you, do you mind if we ask Josh? Okay. Sounds like nobody objects, right?
we'd love to get a second opinion.
All right, Josh, do you have a view on both of these issues, a 2 to 3 year phase in and the market value of assets and actuarial value of assets? Two different questions. What's normal?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the second one first, because I agree with Jen's assessment on that market value versus the actuarial value. You're allowed to smooth assets. It's fairly common for plans to use that the actuarial value of assets when determining their contributions. It's part of the actuarial standards of practice. That 5-year time frame that you have on the assets is also kind of the standard for that smoothing period. So that's fairly common to adopt. I think Jen certainly has a lot more experience than I do with Connecticut public plans from an actuarial perspective. So her, her information, what she can share on kind of how other towns are doing this from the smoothing of all of the assumption adoptions. I think it's important to note, first, that the ADAC is based on the assumptions that you're going to use. So whether you're smoothing that over 2 years, 3 years, or 0 years, the actuarial determined contribution is going to be based on what that smoothing period is. So as long as you're willing to commit to meeting the contribution that is determined based on the liabilities and the assets and the asset smoothing, I don't think that should be kind of what's weighing the concern. I think you all raised some interesting comments around, especially some of the demographic updates, the retirements, kind of the timing of that peaking at 30 plus years, and that maybe the firefighter plan might see a bit, see that delayed a little bit more. There's some questions around how much did the pandemic impact some of the assumptions that have caused big increases. Looking at the plans, the retirement assumption is the second biggest impact, besides the cost of living adjustment. Obviously, that needs to be fixed, given that the plan says what it should be and there was a different assumption being used. But some of these other assumptions, maybe you don't want to immediately jump the gun if things in the next 2 or 3 years are going to smooth out on those assumption elements of increasing the liability. This is probably a great non-answer of there is no standard. There's no standard that one way is right and one way is wrong. It's what do you feel comfortable with in terms of meeting the obligations of the plan? And whether that's immediately recognizing it or doing it over 2 years is certainly a reasonable way of getting there. And what can the town afford to continue to put in? And do you see yourselves being comfortable with modest increases each of the next 2 years rather than a larger increase this year? And I think that a lot of plan sponsors do default towards that, layering in, smoothing in. Maybe it's 2 years, 3 years might be too aggressive to smooth in over 3 years, and that you're recognizing half of the impact this year and half of the impact next year as kind of a 2 year smooth in. I think that's a pretty reasonable approach.
I appreciate that. I'm trying to work something through my mind here. We know that some of the positive market returns are falling off, right? After this year. Am I right?
Right, so for this, on the OPEB side, we're only reflecting the last 2 years, which is positive. So absent any offsetting losses,
Right.
if you adopt that smoothing method now, that's just going to help to reduce future costs in the next couple of years, because you'll recognize more of those gains. in your actual loan assets.
Okay.
With the market being where it is right now,
Right.
the ratio being so very high,
Mhm.
might be a good idea to adopt those smoothing methods for the OPEB.
For- Caroline, do you have any comment on this?
My sense is the 2 year, right? Definitely, the COLA is a big one. I see the health insurance issue as more taking advantage of that. I guess I just need to consider a little bit more with respect to whether it's the actuarial method or the value method. I just don't know enough about the differences and the impact that has.
Okay, I appreciate that. Just want to make sure you were able to chime in. Anybody else have a from our auxiliary seating location?
I'll make a motion.
Why don't you go ahead and do that?
All right, I make a motion that we adopt the 2-year phase-in for the town and the police fire pension plan. And I also, we'll take that first and then I'll make an open.
Okay.
If I get a second.
And just to clarify, and that's including all the other changes that were
Yeah, that's so,
Top row,
just
top
along,
row,
so
top row.
that's we're just voting on the top roll for the town pension plan and the police
okay,
fire pension plan. So it will be the third column,
third column.
second year phase-in of assumption changes.
Okay, I'm gonna second that. Yeah. Why don't we open the floor for any further discussion on that? Anything, Nick? No. George? Nope. Okay. Our esteemed new CFO. Okay. Okay, well, we take a vote on that. All in favor of Eric's motion? Aye?
Aye.
Okay, all opposed? And any abstentions? Okay, that carries unanimously and I appreciate it. I think that was a well discussed and well thought out plan of action.
I got one more motion.
Go ahead.
My next motion is to adopt the 2-year phase-in of both the town OPEB plan and the police fire OPEB plan using the actuary value of assets.
I'll also second that. So that'll be the bottom two?
That would be the third column, bottom.
Right, bottom two, third column.
Yep.
Okay. I'll second that. Open it to the floor. Same questions? Anybody have any further comments? I think we're being responsible. Anybody else? Okay, I'm gonna call a vote on that. All in favor? Aye.
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 Against? Abstentions? Okay, that also passes unanimously. Go ahead. Well, we appreciate it. We've been waiting and waiting so much.
Thank you, great presentation, really.
Excellent presentation.
You did.
Okay, terrific. Thanks again. We can keep these documents?
Yes.
Yeah, you don't want to take them back with you?
Training.
Right. Can we help you with anything on you?
I mean, it's, that may be more new business, but where are we on the portal? Are we?
We're so close.
Right.
Should be reasonable to this.
I'm testing everyone that comes through, running it through Milliman.
Are you gonna do any testing with the unions, a small group in the union level first, or are you just gonna kind of get that one?
We're gonna give, once it's
No,
all
no,
good.
No, we gotta do,
Everything's,
we have other business.
it's
Yeah,
going
we'll be
through.
quick on that. I don't want to make a big thing tonight.
One question, is there anything
Yes,
So that's,
between these
yeah, no, it looks like it's.
yep. So that'll
presentations
come
that
probably February before the
we
board.
should be looking at? To
Uh,
say some of our assumptions that actually might shift the needle.
no,
We'll
no
have an
change in
impact.
calculations.
Anything at all.
Thanks for hijacking, I didn't mean to hijack the.
Things we should monitor?
To see.
I think the answer is that
Are these all extra?
they're doing it on a schedule that is considered to be customary and reasonable.
Right, we've just locked these assumptions in 2 years.
Right.
Yes.
Right, that was our.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I think it'll be, the question on the floor is, which is a good question, is there anything that we should be doing in the intervening time when we see you next? I think the answer is no, now that I think about it, I don't know how we would do it, but are there any of these
The drivers of the.
drivers here that we should be monitoring separate from waiting for you to come every X period of time?
No, no. And I mean, you'll continue to monitor the investment allocation and
Right.
make changes as you see fit.
Right, and I think George has meant more things like the inflation rate and the
No.
cost of living.
I mean, short of targeting
Right.
different provisions, no.
Right, it's a good point.
7%. Keep hitting
A
seven.
lot of this
Right,
is,
Josh, just keep hitting seven.
right,
Don't fail.
okay, well, thanks again, John.
That's it. That was, we had one CIO I used to deal with, he was like 8.75. That's what I'm here for, 8.75. Anything over, great, but I gotta hit that.
It's getting icy out there, so let's watch out.
That's it.
Josh, you're not doing an investment report tonight, correct?
No, I can
Performance,
give a
okay.
quick kind of where assets are, but
I mean, I think we all know what the markets have been doing. If you want to give a 30-second overview, feel free.
Sure. Yeah, I think the last time that we met in early December, we had some October results for you all. Obviously, November was a much better month post-election. Equity rally. Rates came down after they had peaked a little bit in early November. December, a lot tougher of a month, right? The Santa Claus rally that just never appeared. The funds are both the pension and the OPEBs are lower than they were at the end of November, but still around where they were kind of at end of October. So December kind of gave up a fair bit of the gains that you saw in November. Overall, I don't have December performance yet. This early in the month, but for November, the pension fund was up almost 2 3/4%. That's the liquid part of the portfolio. Intra-quarter, tough to get updates from the alternatives managers, the private equity managers. And on the OPEB side, given the higher equity allocation, a much stronger November from the OPEB, up almost 3.5%. Fiscal year to date through the end of November, portfolio is up about 6.5%. Overall for the pensions, 7.7% for the OPEB. So through the first 4 months, trying to meet that 6.9% annual return, both plans were well on their way to doing that. So we'll see what 2025 brings for.
But you think we gave back 2% in December, just to guess a number?
Yeah, it's probably a bit like that. Equity market, the drop kind of over the last 2 weeks, and given that both plans are more heavy in the equity side. We'll see if we get updated prints. Remember, the private equities are going to lag public markets by a quarter or two. And so we haven't fully baked in kind of the summer and early fall rally in the private equity side. So once we get some updated valuation prints from HarborVest and the other managers, that might help balance out the public side that came down a little bit at the end of the quarter.
Okay, could be something to look forward to. So at the last meeting, I raised some issues, wanted to bring to the board's attention the performance of these. From a very big picture now of the funds going back. Josh, you actually had it all the way back to 1999, right? 25 years on the returns, and I think a few people, Nick primarily, raised the good question, which was, okay, you're screaming and yelling about how crappy the performance has been. What do you think the source is? It was a good question. So I asked Josh to run and I want to little discretion for the chairman here. I'm just going to talk about this for 5 minutes and then send you home with it, and we'll discuss it at the next meeting because it's late. And I think this needs to be digested, if that's okay. I mean, I'll talk about this all night, but I'm going to recommend that we sort of just digest it. But my point is that anybody who's known me for a long time, I think there's a very strong case to be made for a much simpler portfolio. So what I asked Josh to do was I said, okay, fine. We had these results over the last 20 years, 24 years. it is what it is, we can't change it. But what we can do is look backwards in a reasonable framework. What I mean by that is, if I said, Chris, I'm a genius, if we just had put all our money in NVIDIA, Josh, go run with those numbers with me. That's not a reasonable thing. Or if I said, I think if we just put all our money into a Bolivian gold mine and so forth, that wouldn't be reasonable. But it would be very reasonable to have said at the time, 25 years ago, we're gonna just have a 70-30 split. We're simply gonna rebalance it on a quarterly basis. BlackRock is gonna see us once a year, not 6 times a year, and just let us know what the numbers are, okay? And then I strongly think that number should be using the S&P 500, because I don't think we should have international. Again, let's leave that to another meeting. But what it does show us, and I think entirely reasonable to know this, is that if we had simply had a 70-30 split using the S&P 500 70%, and Josh, you just used the bond ag, I assume, for the 30?
Yeah.
Okay, so S&P 500 and then the bond ag, which is domestic, would have been an 8.34% versus a 5.81%. So I'm gonna upset everybody at the table right now, but I just did a quick compound interest calculation, making some assumptions that I think were totally reasonable. And very back of the envelope, that cost us $400 million. I'll repeat that number, $400 million.
Well,
Which doesn't mean anything, but it means a lot.
well, but we're comparing it to 70-30 and we were at 60-40 roughly. So, I mean, part of that is just, we didn't have as much equity exposure as we might, right?
When you say 60.
Yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of times where the allocation to equities has varied. I think there's a second page in here that shows comparison to both a 65-35, a 60-40, and reducing down. Obviously a 60-40 with the higher allocation to fixed income, there's not as much dispersion, but still a little bit of dispersion there. I mean, the one thing to also continue to remember is the standard deviation differences. Looking at the volatility that you'd experience with just straight US equities, on the first page here with the 70-30 S&P versus a 70-30 with non-US equities, versus, the current pension, that's one of the big trade-offs. Certainly you could go all in on NVIDIA, right? And you would experience pretty rapid growth, but your volatility would be sky high as well.
Yeah, I mean,
that's, I think, the trade-off that you need to start, that I think is kind of where the discussion around what is the appropriate allocation and how do you hit that target?
Yeah,
how do you balance that?
To not just look at the return number, we need to think about a combination of asset liability, asset to liability management here, and also modern portfolio theory when it comes to portfolio optimization. We're not just trying to maximize return. And, so saying we should just like dump all in on SPX 70-30, that's probably not the appropriate mix for our closed pension fund with a bunch of, people that are, the median age or like the average age is 60+ years old. Like, we need to listen to the actuaries and the asset allocation studies from our OCIO to probably pick the appropriate mix. And giving up the free lunch of, in investing, what's the only free lunch? Diversification, right? Giving that up is probably not the best idea in my opinion.
I will
go ahead.
No, I appreciate that. I am trying to just throw
on the ground on that point.
I'm just trying to throw on the table that we've had 25 years of high fees, not recently when we've moved to the ETFs, but we had a whole period of time we were paying enormous fees to managers for underperformance. We've had horrendous performance on all of our alternatives.
Yeah,
that's a fact. Our internationals allocation has killed us, especially international bonds, which makes no sense whatsoever. We live in America. We pay pensions in America in US dollars. Why we're introducing a currency, risk makes no sense to me. But again, I wanted to just show that there are other ways to do this. That's all. And by the way, it's not like the volatility has gone crazy, going from 9.5% to 10.5%.
On that issue, if I could.
For it.
You can jack up your max drawdown quite a bit, what left tail risks you
Mhm.
take out, like, and then one of the discussions I brought up before is if you look, we had a discussion about what some of the big left tails that this fund has had, Madoff being the biggest one, that was a massive hit to the portfolio that I think we backed the envelope like 10 to 15% of your assets in one go because of a really poor manager selection.
It was more like 40%.
Well, I feel like it was like when you did the adjustment and you like wrapped it up to the end of the top line of the portfolio, you gave up like 15%.
Like, the whole fund was managed improperly, probably.
Yeah, so it just correcting for that 1 year, like it's a big difference.
Quite well.
I would have taken that, I'm gonna
Oh, it's horrible.
Correct.
5.8, you know, you fix that one thing, if I takes that 5.8 up to like 7 and change or something.
I have a
Oh, not bad.
theoretical question, and Josh, this applies to you, maybe more so. Because the town's on the hook eventually through its property tax base.
Right.
$200 million pension, you got
It was enormous.
back.
Right.
You gave up 25 million, 10% to your.
Yeah, right, correct, which, yeah, going
Didn't
forward.
gain anything, and then that asset didn't earn anything.
Mhm. You're right.
It all compounds.
I'm sorry, good.
Sorry.
I just want to cycle back to a going in assumption. Since the town is on the hook through its tax base anyway, is it right? And I'm curious to know, Josh, again, your view on this as well. Is it right to be thinking of the portfolio and the liabilities in isolation from the resources of the town? Basically, the volatility of the portfolio is interesting, and it may have a psychological effect on how we manage the portfolio or future boards manage the portfolio, which is real. But alternatively, if we just take that off, the psychology off the table, the town is a AAA town. The town's going to be making good for the pensions anyway. So my point is, does volatility affect us as much as it would, say, a 65-year-old individual who doesn't have a town behind him or her to make up shortfalls in cash? I think we could be less sensitive to volatility as a town than as a person in a similar capacity. I'm just putting that on the table. I'm not saying
I think that is both true, and then it becomes political.
That's the carve out.
I think it's
like the psychology of this.
We should not be running our pension fund like a 70-year-old retired person. That goes without saying.
Well, when your pensioners are
Well,
getting close to be
pensioners are.
70-year-old retired people, you should be running it like a 70-year-old retired
I
person.
don't know, because the tax base of the town is gonna pay them regardless. If you're on the receiving end.
I mean, you're assuming, you're making the town a put.
Shift that.
Town's not your put. Yeah,
You wanna avoid that.
yeah,
Well,
you,
that's I am.
once
carving out psychology.
everybody's retired and the fund is closed and those people are no longer working, the town shouldn't be paying anything additional for those people. The taxpayers that they worked for, taxpayers that were benefiting from their services at time. So the day that all those people are retired, we're still gonna have a liability, the town. Or they're still gonna have money to pay out.
Let me make
But the
this,
town should not be contributing annually to the fund anymore at that point. You should be 100% funded essentially
Doing that currently.
at that point.
You talk about the employee plan that is slowly closing out.
Say when the thing's 100% closed,
Okay.
which we are now, but everybody's retired. The
Right, no
town
new-
shouldn't make any
no
more
active
contributions to that fund.
Shouldn't
You
have.
should have the present value of your assets should equal the present value of your liabilities. And you should be 100% funded.
Correct.
That's the goal. And then you should keep on hitting your 7% every year in expectation and. You know,
Well, so that's the other part of the math, Nick, right? Is you're using your expected return on assets as the discount rate. So to your hypothetical, once you have this plan that's all retirees and
Still hit the
you know,
6.9.
you'd think about, and how do you do that? In today's capital market environment, a lot easier to do that in a more heavy fixed income portfolio. Go back a decade, zero interest rate policy, you have to take more risk. So
Yeah, but
it's balancing that risk. But I think you brought up a good point.
But our expected growth in assets or in liabilities is gonna be very different when fully closed than it is now. We're not gonna need 7%. We're gonna need.
That's a silo.
Correct, but if you're 100% funded at 7%, right? Once you start adjusting that and now you're 100% fixed income, you're now
We're gonna be-
80% funded, you know?
Yeah, but we're gonna be.
There is that circular
over
reference.
time, as we get there, like, right,
Exactly.
we're doing it now at whatever, a 50-year-old, and then we should be approaching this person's this age, and they're gonna have different than what it is now.
That
It
sounds
is
like,
a changing
it
business.
sounds like liability directed investing, which I know is actually a vogue thing these days. But if you take a step back, I would look at the consolidated portfolio versus consolidated liabilities and not look at every silo individually and say each one should be independently funded. Again, I think the town is behind the whole thing, and we should be, as board members, sensitive to what the town pays. So what I'm saying is, I think returns are a bit more interesting to me than volatility, than another investor situation would imply. I just
And
put
and
that
I
out.
think the volatility point, just looking straight at volatility, we just sat through Jen and Milliman's presentation where you talked about actuarial smoothing of assets. So to say that the plans themselves are a bit less sensitive to volatility may be true because you get to smooth gains and losses over 5 years, but there's drawdown risk, you know, a Madoff situation, and how do you dig yourself back out of that in a closed amortization period? You know, there's the need to be prudent around the amount of risk, but you're still underfunded and you need to hit that return, and even then some increase that return.
That's
If your hope is to relieve some of the burden from the town on having to make those contributions, and you just need to balance out what those maybe expected, you know, one standard deviation risks are. Maybe it's not that different between a bunch of various portfolios, but looking at some of that drawdown risk, what happens in, you know, a 2008 financial crisis situation again, and, you know, people, you know, not to say that's going to happen, but people get laid off, or the composition of employment looks a lot different, and the ability to meet, you know, contributions via tax base looks a little bit different. So there are sensitivities beyond just, well, we can smooth assets. The town's here to back up, you know, the difference in the experience versus the expectations and make up those contributions. You know, there needs to be some of that balance.
I guess what I'm saying is I don't see the volatility differences here as alarming. Somebody said to me, 70-30, a very simplified portfolio with increased equity exposure, I wouldn't be alarmed by that. I'm seeing the stats.
I really just, I'm not actually advocating for anything. I was just trying to throw it on the table, trying to answer some of the questions as to what was the source of the underperformance. Which we would have beaten if we rolled treasury bills from that period forward. So it is.
And once again, what's not in here is you like legit just take out Madoff and correct for that.
Yeah, I would be-
Assume
I
that
would
money
be
was in
curious.
S&P 500 and see.
Yeah,
what
I'd be
it was.
curious. I too would be, and you might be right, might be.
It can be-
You might be avoiding them more now, but the reality is this split further risks, further mitigates any risk of ending up in that scenario. Right? We assume we're not gonna end up in one of those scenarios now, because we made all these different things to avoid that, but we still have risk of something like that occurring. In this scenario, you really avoid that. It's.
I see what you're saying.
With
And
like-
you avoid that-
That's
you avoid that
We
risk.
avoid that
That
risk entirely.
But there are other risks that you bring in. So yeah, it's not necessarily.
There's other risks, but we have way more than 20 years to show. I mean, so run the 50-year projection off of this. You know, run a decade, start layering in decades, and the markets do broadly what the markets do, and the reality is.
As they say, past performance is no guarantee of future results. So we want to be careful.
There's one silo,
Catastrophic.
there's one silo that has considerably underperformed. That still has very high market expectations, and that's non-US equities.
Right.
Right? Even when you look at the stuff that was presented today, it still shows it as getting a greater return
I know.
than US equities. And that's just been killing us.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
if you were to bring that into that blend, that would definitely take.
And by the way, it kills us twice because our domestic equities are getting an enormous international flavor to them already. All these companies are international companies. Boeing is not a domestic company, right? Procter & Gamble's not a domestic company. Pepsi's not a domestic company. These are all international companies. When international does well, they do. So Apple, so we have a substantially higher allocation or exposure to international than I think any of us have understood over time, for whatever reason.
That's definitely been a district.
No, it's been a big negative. And that, by the way, all that shows here, and again, I'm cherry picking, but if you look at the 270-30s here, the better 70-30 is using the S&P, the worst 70-30 is using the world, whatever it is, MCI, whatever index. So again, I knew this would happen. I actually really wanted to throw this on the table to at least answer some questions. I also think personally that our ability to pick and choose alternatives is extremely, regardless of how good our advisor might be, is questionable as well. Not just because of experience, just because of the nature of the.
I see on the footnote of the second page, Josh, you've put the sources for the alts. And I was wondering, are those really investable indices? Or are those just reference?
I mean, private market indices, I mean, similar to broad indices are harder to invest in, though. With an index fund, you could do public markets pretty like for like. Private markets indices represent broadly the broad category. On the real estate side, that's broadly the US real estate industry. So, you know, an individual fund isn't going to invest broadly across all real estate. They're going to pick and choose which properties they're investing in. So you'll never be able to really replicate the index. On the private equity side, it's also across private equity GPs. And that's where, you know, I'd say that manager selection piece and is some of the reason that the fund has underperformed, been more of a manager selection, especially in private markets, whether it's from hedge funds that have been in the portfolio that maybe underperform broadly equity or even hedge fund indexes, or, you know, there is a huge disparity between private equity. I think we looked at over the last couple of years, you know, it's almost 14% between top quartile and bottom quartile. And that's a very big difference, and manager selection matters, especially in private markets. And so trying to replicate the index of private markets, good way to benchmark, do I have a good manager or a bad manager? But it's pretty easy to find managers that are underperforming broadly what you could get if you didn't have a top performing manager that could really drive performance down.
And are these indexes adjusted for survivorship bias?
I'll have to double check on the private equity one. The HFRI one, I don't believe corrects, and the real estate again is just broadly valuation of real estate. It's not a manager index. It's an index of actual of actual properties. It's not that one is not a survivor one, but the PE and the hedge fund may.
So one thing I would add, answering Tom, answering Josh, all of our decisions to pick all of our managers were made with the most earnest and strongest effort to pick good managers. So to think that we're gonna, going forward, make better choices is very foolhardy. So one thing I would urge everyone here is to always assume we're gonna pick an average manager, because by definition, that's what we will do.
There's the issue of survivorship bias, which actually makes it even worse.
That's right, that's 100% correct. 100%, but I'm just saying that we shouldn't fool ourselves or be so, I don't know what word I should use here, to think that we're gonna do better than average, because every single person who sets out to make these choices is trying to do the best they can. So by definition, you're gonna be average, if you're lucky. So I'm just saying, if to Josh's credit, from day one, you said that if you're not in the top decile of these managers, you're going to underperform, and you include the fees. So I say that's a pretty tall wall to climb, bordering on impossible statistically, and that is shown in the results. Even leaving out the extraneous things like Madoff or Allianz, which wasn't really an alternative anyway. And I apologize, some of you guys here weren't even here for some of this stuff, so it might be foreign to you. Anyway, BlackRock is going to build on this dramatically. Josh, correct? We're going to have a lot of education and a lot of discussion about how to thoughtfully build or rebuild our asset allocation. And we may end up being super simple or super complicated or somewhere in between. But I just would like to think that we get to a place that we do it in a way that is realistic about all the decisions we're gonna make. And not kid ourselves about our abilities. That's all I would ask from everybody. Okay, so let's park, unless there's anything else on this, I'd like to park this for BlackRock's future, near future discussion, right? And we do have one or two new business. Eric, could you update us on the situation with these monitoring guys?
Yes, I had a brief discussion with Matthew from Pomerantz. And he had some questions. He wasn't really familiar on the vehicle of the collective trust fund and how it works. I have to actually reach out to Josh, and I have a bunch of questions that Matthew kind of posed to me. I'll go offline with Josh.
In terms of whether they could still be helpful.
Yes, yeah, so there's some questions on whether or not we directly hold the equities or whether we have a share of a mutual fund, which is kind of like how a CTF is structured. And if BlackRock is the one that would take action against a company, if there was a company that was found to be, operating above board. So I'll take it offline with Josh and I'll pose those questions.
Is there any?
Matthew said there may not be a need for his firm if it's structured like we think.
So without being too sarcastic, when you say not a need for his firm, so this is a service that's provided to us at no cost in terms of ongoing, and then they get a cut of the action if they do something for us. So why would we ever not need their services?
Well, because if we don't directly hold the equity in our name, then they can't take action on us, which was kind of where Josh was leading me when we had that discussion. So that's.
Okay, so you'll take it
I'll
off.
take it offline with Josh and
we'll get back to, okay, very good. I thought there was one other conflict of interest. Thank you very much. So actually, I have nothing on this. Does anybody here, David, or maybe, well, you're very new. Last meeting, they handed out a conflict of interest form that we've always signed without thinking about it. Nick brought up an extremely good point that made the form kind of questionable or not even relevant, couldn't even sign it. David, do you have anything on that?
We need to.
Talk to the town
We did, but
attorney?
We need to, yeah, it's the pension board's attorney though. So we'll make a point between now and the next meeting. If we get that solved before the meeting, we may wanna just circulate it to everybody prior to check that box, but that did not get done between when we last met.
Could I understand the issue in just 60 seconds? I'm just curious. I wasn't here.
There was a conflict of interest form that we had to sign that basically says like you're not a public officer of a company, or you're also don't hold more than like 5% of your assets basically in same vehicles as the pension. Same securities as the pension, and traditionally probably not a problem, but now the fund holds IVV, which is like a broad-based, whatever, it's a cheap SPY. And I'm like, well, I hold a ton of IVV, so I can't sign this. Like, it's not as needs to be a little more specific and nuanced now that we hold ETFs in the funds. Just, we hold the same.
And the letter was very simplistic. It had been bouncing around for years. It's probably the type of thing that you'd anyways want to just make sure that it went to the,
I think Caroline had specific input on that as well. Are you still on?
Yes, I'm still on. Yes, that was the least of what we needed to do, right? We needed to have some sort of conflict of interest policy overall, right? Not just dealing with those two items. So that was a further discussion that we need to have.
Okay, so why don't we let David and Tom work with the pension attorney or engage them, and I'll be on that, and then we can hopefully get something to circulate sooner than later.
yeah, and we can address possibly the conflict piece in that these boards are still fall under the ethics and conflict policies of the town. They're town appointed boards. So most of that is actually, that policy is something to circulate. This was an additional item, sort of, that
Okay, we'll work through it, but kudos to Nick for identifying something fairly obvious. Last thing, I've been asked by a couple of members offline, so I just want to raise this. Can we, at the next meeting, from one of you two guys, probably you, get just refresh us on D&O insurance for these boards? What our protections are. A lot of new members on the board have asked me this question. I'm not equipped to give a cogent answer on it. So what insurance, I know we've taken out independent insurance. What is the town's policy on indemnifying members of boards like this? If, God forbid, some resident board to say we're deficient in our duties, and took a look at these things I'm preparing and came after us. So I think that would be helpful. And it could be in writing before the meeting, so we have something to talk about when we come next time.
Didn't we get a new policy about 2 years ago, or didn't we?
No, I know we have stuff. I just think it'd be helpful for all the new members of the board that we just make sure. Look, everybody should be totally comfortable on that issue. And we want to recruit good people, and that's one of the issues that I always get asked.
Well, I think one of the things we talked about too is providing an onboarding packet,
Yes.
right? So as a new pension board member, you would maybe get a booklet and everything, the trust documents and stuff like that. We always talked about it, we never put it together, but that maybe
we
something
should,
to work on.
If I could, I was around for that discussion, and there were at least 3 issues. Tom, since you were, if you don't mind, I'll just iterate them. One was, is the insurance carrier rated? And we had a really hard time getting a rating, like an S&P Moody's Fitch, the one that does insurance companies, I forget the name of it. So that was one issue. The other was the limit per member. The accumulated limit, that'd be related. And then the third issue was occurrence versus
Total? I agree, total.
No, it's reported. It's either occurrence based when the event occurred or when it's reported. And the insurance company, I think it said occurrence based. So if we don't report the issue to the insurance company in time, we're not covered. And all 3 issues were discussed ad infinitum, and it was really hard getting answers, just so you know.
There was a pretty fairly comprehensive summary, I think, in the annual report. But I'm sure there's some detail under that I can get.
Well, it'd be appreciated if we could boil it down.
My wife.
AI could boil it down for
My wife
us.
has asked me about this.
I'm sorry?
My wife has asked me about this, and I think, Walter, maybe it was you, but somebody said at the meeting, I don't want to lose my house over a volunteer role.
Right.
And mentioned.
Oh, it's a totally reasonable concern. And, these are boards where we have a lot of turnover, so things that might be comfortable or second nature to some of us may not be to others who are
To be honest,
relatively new.
Ken, I left the discussion not completely comfortable.
Okay.
And I described it to my wife, who's also a financial analyst, and she said, I'm not comfortable. Why are you doing this for free? It's great.
So in the interest of not having Tom's wife on his case, we're gonna get,
You don't want that.
right, we're gonna try and get a summary that makes everybody comfortable, okay? Anything else? Okay, anybody want to make a motion?
Motion to adjourn.
Second,
Second.
thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, everybody. Long meeting, and I appreciate everybody's attention.